Kate Zambreno is the author of 8 books, most recently Drifts and To Write as If Already Dead. She is at work on an essay collection, The Missing Person, to be published by Riverhead, and a novel, Home. She is the Strachan Donnelly Chair in Environmental Writing at Sarah Lawrence College and teaches in the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University. She's a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction. Susan Bernofsky is an associate professor of writing at Columbia University School of the Arts and director of the literary translation program at Columbia's MFA writing program. She's translated over 20 books, and tonight she'll be discussing her new book, Clairvoyant of the Small, The Life of Robert Walser. So welcome, Susan and Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for meeting me to talk about Robert Walser.
It's an honor. And I just want to say thank you to Michael Holtman at the Center for Art of Translation and Stephen Sparks and everyone at Point Reyes Books. This is exciting. Have you been doing a lot of press for the book?
A bit. This is the third event of the sort of launch series, and there've been some interviews and stuff, but yeah.
It's an interesting, I mean, I've read you speak about translating Walser in the past, and that the idea of the translator is to hear the voice, like to hear the voice of the writer. And this is a different role for you to step in to speak of the life more.
Yeah, that was weird too, because, you know, yeah, so, I mean, I've been translating him for 30 years, and I have this, like, when I read him in German, I have this voice in my head in English, and I think that's Robert Walser's voice. But really, you know, that's not Robert Walser's voice. It's, you know, it's my voice that I associate, my English language voice that I associate with him. And I sort of working on the biography, I realized at a certain point that I had this feeling that I knew him really, really well. And then, wait a minute, I've had some therapy. I can parse this out. You know, how much of this is projection? Oh, all of it? You know, you know, I wound up taking a big step back and saying, okay, what if I can't rely on my feelings and have to rely on facts?
Right.
And that was a bit of a shock, because starting the project, I felt, well, I feel I know who he is. And then, no, what I discovered is I really, really don't, and was trying to just figure out how to navigate that.
It's interesting hearing you speak about this, because the voice that English language readers hear is that voice that is yours and his. So we hear the voice too.
You're sharing my delusion.
I do. It's a communal delusion in terms of this wonderful Walser voice.
I don't think people appreciate the extent to which, like, we read world literature in translators' voices. From, you know, literature and translation is so shaped by the voice of the person who's translating it, and, you know, where nobody's trying to use their own voice. They're trying to use their understanding of the writer's voice, but it's still, you're getting at the literature from around the world through the interpretation of another person, always, unless you're reading it in that language.
There's something so deliciously uncanny about that, I think, about the act of translation, and this sort of, it's the familiar, and it's also the strange in some way.
It's ghostly.
Yeah, it is.
Go
on, sorry. It is ghostly. It is ghostly. And you've been haunted by Walser for a long time.
Look who's talking.
I mean, I feel that I'm haunted by you being haunted by Walser. But I want to read from you, actually, you quote from one of my favorite lines, a sort of story, and the novel I'm constantly writing is always the same, and it might be described as a variously sliced up or torn apart book of myself. And I want to kind of ask you about that. So with this very specific writer who you have brought to the English language. You know, you have been so instrumental in translating so many of his major works. What does that mean for him? Major works, minor works, his works. So what is the role of the biographer with Walser to piece together these pieces, and why is that like so interesting with such a slippery writer?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because he's always writing about himself, and it's always a mask, like always. That book of myself is also a tricky translation problem, because that in German is Ich-Erzählung. It's an I story, and that's a way of saying a first person narrative. But so the words that mean first person narrative can also be translated as book of myself, and that's something that Christopher Middleton translated the phrase that way, and I quote it that way because I think he was right to interpret it that way, because, you know, Walser's not saying it's not just one big first person narrative. It's a narrative that reveals the I. You know, it's an I narrative. Yeah, but you know, there's this whole strain in Walser's work where he's like, you know, no one has the right to act towards me as if he knew me, and he's always writing these incredibly self-revealing things that I think in many cases truly are self-revealing, while always also at the same time saying, yeah, look at this person who I'm exposing. Who is this again? And putting in question who this I is. But is it him, the I, or is it just an I? Is it, you know, a persona that's saying I? And he's always playing with that.
He's always playing with masks and masquerades. So that's quite a dilemma for a biographer. Do you feel like part of the play of a Walser piece that is an I piece is to kind of, or even across his pieces, to have these like puzzle pieces in which he's like leaving these like clues for you to decipher as a detective?
You know, I was really, really relieved to find a couple of places where there were like real life documents that coincided with his fictional documentation of an episode, because, you know, laying those side by side, and there's an extended series of that early on in Zurich when he's trying to get a job at the socialist magazine, because he suddenly, you know, met these like older women who were really into socialism. They got really excited about socialism for a short while. And he was really, really full of passion and really, really wanted to work for this magazine. And, you know, I think the ideals of socialism continue to play a role in his work, but he stopped wanting to become, you know, himself politically active. But, you know, the letters that he writes to somebody who was in fact, a really mediocre poet, but at the time, as a young person, he looked up to, he later rewrote that scene in a way that makes him come off seeming a little more suave than he really was at the time. At the time, he was like, oh my God, you know, older, established, published poet giving me the time of day, talking to me about my work. He was genuinely really excited, as the documents show, but as his own later documentation has him sort of already sort of ironizing that encounter that at the time I think was very sincere for him, and, you know, part of his growing process, because he emulated the guy's crappy poems.
Yeah, I love thinking about Robert Walser, young socialist. But yeah, I think that I think especially now with contemporary gaze, there can be a impulse to see a first person narrative as all sincere, and that the search is authenticity. But with Walser, as you write so well, it is this pose of irony, or this like, there is truth, but it's not about the search for truth. It's really about like some sort of puzzle, some sort of ironic pose, or
I think that he has this way of being at the same time ironic but still sort of sincere
Yeah.
at the same time, which usually you don't get. Usually people are in earnest, or they are sarcastic, or have a stance towards what they're telling you, and they want you to know they have a stance. And he has a way of ironizing in such a way that you see him making fun of it and meaning it at the same time. He has a lot of cake that he's already eaten.
Well, even though, I mean, as you write so well, and I think really shedding light on some maybe myths or untruths of what we think about Walser in terms of being a published writer. His work was at times well received, especially earlier on, but he was always viewed as like a naive, like with his pose of naivete, and that was always taken, the sweetness was always taken at a surface level.
Yeah. Well, some writers like Hermann Hesse really seems to have taken him as like this charming, naive writer, which made him crazy because he wanted Hesse to respect him as a colleague, and Hesse is like, oh yes, I super respect you for your cute, charming little stuff, and so there was implied condescension in this, what for Hesse was genuine admiration, but admiration on terms that really stuck in his craw. Like Max Brod, though, and Kafka, I think, really saw him the way he wanted to be seen, and kind of understood the sort of complex stance in the work. And so those were really writers who, he never met either one of them in person. He exchanged letters with Max Brod, never with Kafka. But those were, I think, his true colleagues, even though the sort of collegial exchange didn't quite happen. It happened a little more with Brod than with Max Brod,
right?
Say it the comprehensible way, than it did with Kafka. Kafka was always filtered through Max Brod.
I was thinking about like the concept Kafkaesque and how overused it is, but that it's so much part of the way that people think about, I don't know, like bureaucratic nightmare, or like an atmosphere of paranoia or surveillance. And so I was thinking, well, Kafkaesque, maybe Kafkaesque, I mean, and you are also a translator of Kafka, but Kafkaesque is atmosphere maybe, or some sense of unease that's created in the fiction. And you use the term Walserian a couple of times in the biography. And also, like, even as you're saying, in Walser's life, Kafka's referred to as like a Walser type. He was seen as derivative of Walser. But when we think of Walserian, is it that sweetness, that ironic pose, or is it, as you write about so marvelously here, the sentence quality, or is it more like this mythos of this urban nomad? So what do we think about when we think Walserian? Like, what is Walserian?
If this is a multiple choice test, can I do
A, B, C?
I want to pick the all of the above option. Now I don't even remember how I used the word in the book, because I think of it as all these things. Although if you were asking me off the bat, out of context, what I thought what Walserian was, I would default to thinking of it as speaking in a really complex maximalist way about something that's ostensibly small and inconspicuous, unimportant.
Well, it was just something
which is a kind of ironic stance.
So what I really love about, I love many things about this biography, is how much you think about just how amazingly weird his sentences were. And that sort of level of and that's what I would think of as Walserian, is like the sentence structure, but I guess I was thinking, is Walser, like when we think of Kafkaesque, even though Kafka's life has taken on this very mythic quality, we're not thinking of his life, but I think Walser, what we think of the myth of the writer that he was, like how much does that infect how people read him or approach him?
I mean, I think he screwed himself in a way by harping on a certain sort of naive, happy-go-lucky persona in a lot of his writings, and so people came to associate that with the man himself, which did not serve him, you know, in trying to achieve career success, which he was in fact trying to achieve. You know, I hear, you know, a lot of people's ideas about Walser that have to do with his turning his back on, you know, the practical world of this and that. It's like, no, he was trying to earn a living this whole time. And, you know, that, you know, there was a turn of the century kind of playfulness, gesturing towards playfulness that he was into, especially in his early career, where he's writing about page boys and, you know, page boys romancing, you know, older married ladies in their villas, which are, you know, like the early 20th century equivalent of a castle, right? And playing with these old tropes, these old sort of Germanic fairy tale-ish tropes. But for him, that was material to be played with. It wasn't like an ethos. It wasn't like a world he was trying to belong to. You know, he wasn't some like ethereal dreamer. He, you know, he was a working writer. Like you would speak of a working musician. He spent most of his life, you know, supporting himself by writing for newspapers, which was, you know, a way a writer could make a living. He had a job. And in The Walk, he writes about that. He writes about, you know, we see him going to the tax office and to the bank because he's received a fellowship, and talking about the craft and art of writing, but also the profession and the labor of it.
Yeah, and I think you illuminate that so well in the biography, that he, you know, distinct from Kafka, who wanted to be out of the commodification of his writing, even though, you know, Kafka did publish a bit, Walser was, not only did he desire to make money in writing, that he was this professional writer. And I think the culture of the feuilleton and the idea that writers did make money and had the patronage of newspapers, that they could expect it, is very different than an American literary culture, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and Kafka's first writings were also this kind of feuilleton type writing. And I would say, thinking about Kafka's career and Walser's career, that Walser had a higher tolerance for precarity. And so, yeah. Kafka, you know, had his day job that, you know, he, I think, felt as squelching his creative talents, you know, but he was also good at it and took it seriously. You know, for those watching at home, anyone who doesn't know, you know, he was a lawyer, and he worked at a workers' accident insurance, bureau. And I mean, he made important contributions, such as, you know, he was the one who made it happen that, you know, with this new factory technology and this new machinery that workers were using that could injure them, you know, it's like, if somebody loses a finger to a factory accident, how much of a payoff does he get? How much of a payoff do you get if you lose 2 fingers? You know, he put a financial value on the injuries that workers were sustaining because of this new technology. And, you know, one could say, okay, that's very cynical. But on the other hand, people were, you know, sustaining physical injury without any sort of compensation. And so he was seeing, you know, he made a contribution besides the literary contribution.
I love that illustration.
He didn't quit.
I love that illustration of the cut off fingers that illustrate his report about the hands. And you write so well. You know, Kafka had a law degree. Kafka was, you know, his day job he took quite seriously. And Walser did more of this like pattern of quitting, getting the day job. And was it because the ambition was the ambition just to be able to write the text, or was the ambition, and what was the texture of his ambition? Did he want to be kind of a literary star?
Right. So, and this is where one has to sort of fill in blanks, because that's not, there's places in which he writes of dreaming of fame, but these are sort of places that are fictional. Mm-hmm. So, we don't have good proof from his life of that. Based on what we do know, I believe that he really was wishing to have commercial success with his writing, with his novels, and I think it just killed him. He wrote 3 novels. The third of them, Jakob von Gutten, is just a masterwork of early 20th century literature. And the fact that Jakob von Gutten, he wrote this incredibly, unbelievably path-breaking, gorgeous novel, and it was a flop. I mean, people liked it, but it didn't sell. So it was a flop in the sense of, his hoping to earn a living, but it also got mixed reviews. But it should have been the book that catapulted him into the kind of career like young Hesse was having and young Thomas Mann was having, but it didn't. And I think that just broke his heart.
And you attribute that in some part to the fact that he stayed with kind of an art publisher who was just like this very small print run. I mean, it is almost like a corollary to today's American publishing culture, that he had this publisher who kind of paid him regular sums to keep writing, which is interesting, but ultimately,
I think of those as bribes. Those were bribes to not leave him for the correct publisher.
Yeah. So, and ultimately he didn't get this success in Berlin, right? In Germany. Like that was but it's interesting too, though, because I mean, yes, he had this ambition towards the novels, but it also feels like the writing and his desire for writing contradicted what would have been necessary to make that commercial success. Yeah. Like you write that, his work gets much more complex and coded.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he gets, he does his most, well, he does most of his most interesting work in the short form, but I mean, for me, his other, like for me, Jakob von Gutten is his early masterwork, and The Walk is in between, mid-career, and then his late masterwork for me is the novel The Robber, the one that he never even copied over the manuscript to submit it to anyone. It's like everything that's great about Walser is in that really, really weird book that was only ever a rough draft. That's what we're reading, his rough draft, and it's strange and gorgeous and very self-flagellating and self-revealing, really just, self-violent in a sense, that book.
There's often a misconception that he wrote these, like the pencil works, the microscripts, only in the asylum, but The Robber was one such work.
Yeah. He wrote many, many, many such works. I mean, the vast majority of them that we have were written before the asylum. So I called it the asylum in the book. Today, it's a psychiatric hospital, but I decided to use a period term. This is one of the many anachronism related decisions I faced, what to call things. Like now, what is called in the book Waldau Asylum is now the, blah, 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 psychiatric clinic. But yeah, I mean, almost all of the surviving microscripts come from the years before he entered the clinic. And yeah. But so it's like part of the it's the romanticization of him. It's like, oh yeah, you put him in the hospital, you lock him away, and then he in protest writes these things. But no, he was already writing this just as part of his survival mechanism that started much earlier.
And so I think I felt like there was a lot to chew on in the biography, thinking about why he worked by pencil. I mean, it feels like there was so many different aspects to it. I would love to hear you speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. So the best explanation we have from him is that is from a letter he wrote in 1927, I think it is, to his editor Max Reichner, explaining it. And he says that that he experienced a sort of breakdown, a mental breakdown, I assume is what he means. He uses the word breakdown, Zusammenbruch, I think, near the end of his years in Berlin after the flop of his third Berlin novel, and then his inability to write another one. He tried and just couldn't bring himself to do it, couldn't get another one together, and was drinking a lot, which, always helpful, as we know. And he associated the novel writing with his penmanship and handwriting. And keep in mind, he worked for years. He did an apprenticeship as a bank clerk and worked, supported himself as a clerk. And he had beautiful copperplate hand. He could write a bunch of different styles, gorgeous, very, very controlled. I think he was even praised in school for his excellent handwriting. And so the certain penmanship perfection came to feel associated, as I understand from what he wrote later, associated with these feelings of failure and paralysis. Mm-hmm. And, so he writes about getting a cramp in his hand that he understood as both physical and psychological, and writing with a pencil, which is, how kids learn to write, just freed him from that whole mechanism by making a physical change, which makes perfect sense. You hold it differently, you write in it differently. He changed the configuration.
And also it didn't count, really. There was a sense that the pencil...
Yeah.
But it also seems like, to read between the lines, that the pencil method also maybe contributed to his new style, that the sort of the Garland-like nature of the sentences, you write that it allows him to slow down or be more patient with the language. I wonder if copying it out allowed less efficiency with the language, more of this decorative, ornate.
It required him to do an additional step because it was clear that his first draft would not be submitted. So perhaps that did allow him a greater sense of freedom, because he knew that this was just going to be, as he says in one prose piece, for the cat, meaning, it's for naught, for, wasted effort.
So it was a period of time at the end where there did seem to be some spirit of renunciation, but that there was abundance to that in terms of the work that it possibly produced.
Yeah, I mean, he writes about the pencil territory as being a site of joy. He speaks about it as something that's liberating to him, and so that's beautiful. It gives him freedom, and and he did, when copying things over, change stuff up, which we will know more about. There's a new edition of these works in preparation. So when he died, there was a big pack of these manuscripts. I think 526 might be the right number, something like that. And it took two scholars, Bernhard Echte and Werner Morlang, 12 years to decipher the equivalent of 6 volumes of these writings. So 12 years just reading and transcribing them, because it was so difficult to read. And they transcribed the manuscripts that had not been published in also, in slightly different form, because there was just too much labor. And so there's a new team of scholars, with lots of grant funding and an army of grad students working on it in Switzerland now, that are going to do a new edition of microscripts that's expanded, that will also, as I understand it, include manuscripts that were also published, copied over and published in other forms. So we'll be able to get a better sense of how he revised them in this period of his life, which should be interesting. I wrote something about revisions from the teens, but we don't really know so much about these late revisions.
I found myself longing to know about your relationship with Walser's hand. With it, I mean, it seemed you write very intriguingly that his handwriting changes in different ways. But this is 30 years of you knowing, having an intimate relationship to like the gestural and graphic aspect of his writing in a way that we don't get in the printed word.
Yeah. But I can't read the microscripts either. You know, seriously, they're not legible. I mean, the transcribers said that they thought that he himself perhaps would not have been able to read them if enough time elapsed. They were, you know, a way for him to remember something in the short term, because they're, you know, they're written in, they're blunt pencil, shrunken down, you know, that old German Gothic script. It's very different from kind of like Roman handwriting, which is what modern German language handwriting is, like the handwriting we use in English with letters that have this shape. But the old German handwriting is very, very different in shape, and it's very up and down, and there's different, you know, different lengths of strokes signify differently. And, you know, so there's a lot of things that just look like little, like pen scratches, and like what a vertical line might be an E or an N or a O or a, you know, there's any one number of letters. So there's longer lines, could be an F or an S or a, you know, there's different letters it could be. And so the transcribers say they were guessing really at what a word says. It's like you can't read it, but you can guess what it says, and then you know, verify your guess. There was one example that Werner Morlang told me about, one of the transcribers. There was a word that they had transcribed as Königin der Nachtnägel, which is queen of the night nails, like long fingernails on a scary woman. Queen of the night nails, Königin der Nachtnägel. And no, but then they later decided it was wrong. It was Clytemnestra nails. But those two names were similar enough. But handwriting, you know, I loved going to the archive and looking at the way he wrote letters, even because his handwritings changed. But he also I got the feeling even from early on, he had a whole repertoire of different handwritings that he could, you know, pick from as the occasion required, you know. And so that is also a kind of masquerade, you know.
Yeah, it's like different personas, different handwriting. So just, you know, I really appreciated you linking his work more to the high modernists, to like Gertrude Stein or Joyce, because he's so often considered alongside, like, you know, fellow German language writers. But this idea of this, like the maximal, the artificial, the sentences that kind of are so increasingly complex.
He didn't know their work though. It was, I mean, this is my feeling, that his project is similar to theirs, and I just feel that it was like in the air at the time, you know. Just the life of the early 20th century to me just seemed like a fertile ground for bringing forth this kind of approach to language. But that's, you know, I'm not a scholar of modernism. This is how
I'm not either.
But the more I sat down, like, oh, I should learn more about modernism, the more I started reading about modernism. That is such a slippery topic, and there's not that much agreement on what actually modernism is, which is also in and of itself interesting, I think. But for me, I describe as modernist this moment of deciding that language is a plastic medium that one sculpts, as opposed to seeing it as this sort of more 19th century model of like a vehicle, a transparent vehicle for communicating information. You know, the moment when the vehicle itself becomes part of the story.
Yeah, I really like that. There's this word you use in here that I had to look up, and it felt like a very Walser word, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's tergiversation. And to tergiversare means to show reluctance, to go, to turn, to evade, to go back. And that just felt like, it feels like such a particularly Walser word, both for his life as well as what happens when you're entering the space of one of his texts.
Yeah, I wanted to use the, you know, I saw an opportunity to use the word, and I wanted to, just because he's always using these like crazy words.
Totally.
And, you know, he's always using these wacky words that are sort of forgotten. I don't know. It's a little tribute to him.
You this is from an interview from 10 years ago. You said that. You said, I mean, you've been working on this for how long have you been working on this, Susan?
I first wrote a grant application to try and get support to do some research back when in my freelancer days, and that was 2005, 2006. I don't know. I tell people I worked on it for a decade, but it was really longer, and I was thinking about it beforehand, but yeah.
But you said my book of Robert Walser is a book of gaps, which I thought was so beautiful and true. And how did you?
This is what happens when you write about somebody who liked to live like nomadically and just threw away everything and never kept anything. And it's like half the stuff we have, like documents that he has, is only because he decided to write a microscript on the back of it, so it's survived. You know,
amazing.
As is in this form, yeah.
So the major gaps, I guess, are like what happened between him and Carl. What happened between the brothers. By the way, I think there should be like an HBO series called The Walsers. And it should be Carl and Robert Walser. And it should be like the great, like kind of
Lisa,
costumey.
Obviously.
Yeah, and Lisa. And it should be like shabby chic, kind of like, but like, yes. No, and it should be about Carl and Robert, like raconteurs.
That'd be great if they could get paid. I'm sure that they were incredible, hilarious fun to watch them, because I'm sure that they like egged each other on and, you know, just got really raucous, and they both, you know, went to parties. They were young, they were tall, and drank too much, and just got really wild and played pranks on people.
Like Gossip Girl, but it's going to be called The Walsers. You can use it. It's all you. You can have it.
Thanks. Are we sure this isn't going to be your next novel, Kate?
Oh, I'm sure. I just thought there was something so glamorous and sexy about them, but we don't really know, right? We don't really know what happened with these fallings out with his family members.
But family stories like that, you know, are shrouded in shame, and of course they're not documented because people don't write about their shame objects. And so that was a really uncomfortable family story. And so what remains is speculation and, you know, what someone told someone, what told somebody about what happened, you know. So I relate like a third-hand story as marking it as such, but that's the only form in which stories, are available. Yeah.
I mean, striking.
Carl Zelig could have found out if he had set his mind to it, because everyone was still alive. Well, enough people were still alive. You know, later it's like no one's left.
It's striking that, you know, this period of his life that is maybe the most infamous is the quiet years in this book. You know, it's the last chapter, this period of almost 3 decades of unknowability. And how did you think about like wrestling with that when writing this?
You know, for the longest time while I was working on the book, and until I got more than halfway through, I was planning to write 2 final chapters, like one version in which he stops writing and never writes again, and one version in which he secretly continues to write throughout, because this is controversial, whether or not he stopped writing. And when I first started coming around, you know, the Walser community in the 1980s, pretty much everyone was saying, you know, he stopped writing. You know, they look at the Carl Zelig line that he reports in his book, I can only, one can only write in freedom. He stopped writing, they incarcerated him, and that was it, done with writing. And then when a report surfaced, Catherine Sauvat, who also wrote a biographical book about Walser, she was a journalist, a French journalist, is a French journalist who got really interested in his work. And she went to Reyes and looked for people, around the asylum who had worked there. And she found, I think she found Joseph Verles when she found an old man who was a very young man, had been a young attendant, who told her he had seen Walser writing. And then, this was kind of discounted. Oh, come on, he's an attention seeker. He must just be saying that because he can get press attention. It can't be true. But meanwhile, there are enough different reports of different people, different kinds of people saying they saw him writing, that I, in the course of working on it and looking at all this evidence, became convinced that they did see something, and it wasn't just all of these people saying this thing to make the questioner happy. So, but this is still, it's controversial. I looked at the stories and decided that I believe them, also because it makes sense for how I understand Walser. I'm sure he did stop writing, especially in the first Reyes period, under Hinrichsen, under an asylum director who he, despised and feared, but above all despised. But after that, I do think it makes sense to me that he would have written again for himself.
If he was given paper and pencils, yeah. If he was given the means to, which is so often an issue with the asylum. Yeah, it makes sense. I feel reading your biography of him, going through really imagining the interiority of the life of a writer, it doesn't make sense that he would stop unless he was not given. He was still walking.
He was still walking, I mean, and there's so much evidence that, he was not somebody who required long-term hospitalization. He was certainly not well, but, probably his mental health could have been managed. He could have managed it himself. But, I mean, I did my best to write how I understood the complex of circumstances that together kept him in the hospital for decades. But, in fact, he always seemed relatively sane, on the scale of not at all to quite sane,
Well, it also just seems like he didn't have a real exit. He didn't have a real plan towards that. I mean, it seems like he was, as you depicted it in terms of the narrative of a life, it seemed like he got increasingly desperate, and that his precarity was, and also, something that you document so well is how much, this post-war culture, the economic life of a writer changed. There wasn't really, Joseph Roth and others wrote feuilletons afterwards, but there really wasn't, a place for, I'm not saying this in a romantic way, but just in a really practical way. Unless he could work a job, how is he going to support himself?
And the other, one way of saying it is the other thing that happened to him was middle age. He's, sailing through this, well, not sailing through, but, finding his way through this uneasy life. And then he turns 50, and, age 50 is the age when everything started to just seem more difficult. And 50 then was older than it is now.
Especially for someone who's such a heavy drinker, and the culture, the sense of being so peripatetic through boarding houses. That's less romantic. That becomes less less comfortable to not have that stability. Well,
and he saw his father living like that at the end of his life too, which was not a pretty sight for him.
Right. I think there's your biography, there's a real, I think that there's so much vitality about thinking about the life of a writer, and his persistence. But I think it's quite, fittingly for Walser the worker and Walser the temporary socialist at one point, it's quite the story of also, I think, what it meant to be an artist and a writer without means at that time, how he could support himself and where would he live. You emphasize his bachelorhood as well, and his lack of connections besides Carl. Okay, so please ask questions.
Ask you a question? Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sure.
Because after Drifts, I was really excited to talk to you, because I know he's a writer who's meant a lot for you, and you clearly also have your own image of who he is. Did I break your heart in the book? Were there things that you learned about him that changed what the picture you had of him that was important to you?
Because I've always been fascinated with him as a jobbing writer. For me, part of what has interested me about Kafka and Walser as very different writers, but was their relationship to money and precarity and stability. So it was something that I was pretty aware of, how much he wrote feuilletons, how much he wanted to be a writer. So that, to me, the Walser beauty is the sense of disappearance within the work, and the way he so slippery plays with autobiography and biography in the writing. That's always what I've loved so deeply about Walser. And I've always felt, deep sadness for his asylum experiences in some ways, especially, but to me, it's, a story of, it's also such a material and economic story of a specific life of a writer. That's not, that's how he made money, what his chances are. To me, none of that was a surprise, although I appreciated you bursting that mythos, because I think that I always think it's so important to illuminate that being a writer is also being a worker in many different ways. I loved reading about his butler school, which I didn't really know. I had known kind of the myths of all of the jobs that he worked. And I love the story you tell about, being out of college and working in the Zurich Walser archive and then mopping the floors at night. It's such a Walser scene. But that
was an important break for me, because I was broke, and I had gone and seen a theater performance of this theater called Theater Unser that had totally blown my mind, such that I put something in their donation box, and then went to look at my bank account to draw something out to replace that, and realized there was nothing left in there. And it was oh no. It's dumb, impractical, idealistic young student, right? And it was this was a gig I really needed, and so I was so happy to have the gig and also to have the key.
Yeah, but I loved reading about all of it, but no, it didn't. There was no, but there's the whole I want to ask questions. I want other people to ask questions, but there's the whole Enrique Villamata's Writer of the No, and I've always kind of wondered, about that, about the nature of his renunciation. So let me see. Okay. So, okay. This is from Stacy. Susan, considering that Walser was Swiss and likely grew up speaking dialect, could you speak about how and what ways that may have shaped his language, and perhaps the nuances that you've had to consider as a translator because of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's an important part of thinking about his writing because, you know, well, first of all, what we think of as German is the, you know, dialect of German spoken around the town of Hanover. It's like the whole German speaking realm is made, you know, was made up a bunch of principalities and they each had their own, you know, specific form of German. So, you know, I'm trying not to use the word dialect because I think I read somewhere that the word dialect is like no longer a thing, but it's like a bunch of different overlapping languages. I don't know how else to say it. In Switzerland, it's called dialect. But you know, there's different Swiss Germans also. You know, there's Zurich German and Bern German, which is what he spoke, being from Biel, which is part of the whole Bern thing. Although probably if you grow up in Biel, you hear differences between how you talk and someone from the town of Bern. You know, so lots of regionalisms, and he plays with that. But he was always trying to write for, or at least, you know, starting the Berlin years, certainly trying to write for an audience that definitely included Germans, because sort of Berlin was the, you know, Berlin was the cultural nexus of the place where everyone was going. So he was trying to write what was called High German at the time, also known as Schriftdeutsch, or written German. But there's certain Swiss words that show through, like the word obschon shows up instead of obwohl. There's certain markers of Swissness in the language. And then he also plays with Swiss words, which is really fun. And this becomes invisible in English. Like there's some in Berlin stories, I don't remember how I translated it now. In Berlin stories, there's a text about Berliners, and it ends with a whole long adjective of, a long list of adjectives about the Berliners. And the last one is like schaffig, which is a Swiss word for industrious. And it's funny because he's using a Swiss word to talk about the Berliners. I don't even remember what I did with that. So a lot of that gets lost. But he usually, when he's using Swiss words, he's using it in playful ways. So I try and be playful in some way. But you know, the relationship between Swiss language and High German is largely invisible in English by necessity.
But you also seem to trace in the biography a shift that happens for him of his Berlin ambitions to become this sort of what we might call a crossover Hermann Hesse writer, to deciding that he's a Swiss writer. Is that true, or am I?
Yeah. No. I think that is true. You know, in a sense, though, you know, it's like he was ejected from that whole Berlin life, and you know, after the war, couldn't, you know, all the German publishers were, you know, it wasn't really happening. Yeah, but I think the war and all the nationalism that he saw surfacing, even among German writers, really took him aback. So that whole war experience, I think, made him feel much more identified with Switzerland and his, you know, his own nationality.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So HM says, what about the idea that he was writing in the way he was at Waldo because he didn't want the work to be read, and was a conscious shift into the asemic, so like this drawing, writing, and are there implications for an ethics of the decipherment? So do you get us? I'm going to clip one more thing to it. Do you feel like he saw the microscripts as asemic writing, that they were meant to be these like visual works that went into illegibility? And then also to answer the question, is there an ethics to the decipherment of these indecipherable texts?
Right. So these are private documents. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question. Um, he was definitely writing in this way that could not easily be read long before he entered Waldau asylum in 1929. But think about it like this, he was living in furnished rooms with landladies who could at any moment when he was out go into his room, and probably they did. There was probably housekeeping, and as part of the package. So he was renting a room, and probably someone would come in and sweep his room every week or two, right? And maybe happen to look at the papers lying on his desk, right? And if the landladies could read, the mostly older women he rented rooms from, if they could read what he was writing, that might not be so good for the, landlady tenant relationship. So, something about this tiny writing that could not be read, I think, was perhaps of practical use among other things at the time. And sure, it helped safeguard his privacy in the institution also. Is it a violation of his privacy to read these drafts? Maybe sort of. I'm going to say the fact that he copied over many of them for publication. Yeah, it's a fair question, though. I'm brushing it off a little bit. Maybe it shouldn't be brushed off, because it's a broader question. If any writer has manuscripts that they choose not to publish, are they fair game to publish after their death?
Right. I mean, it does connect to that question, yeah, of the manuscript, especially if you ask for them to be burned or destroyed, and how seriously to take that. Yeah. One of my first exposures to Walser was a show at the Drawing Center, which put his manuscripts next to Emily Dickinson's envelope poems. And it's nice thinking of both of them working within settings where like secrecy became kind of part of the work, like the way, like what they wrote on and their limitations actually inform the style and the process of the work.
Oh, so that's your Walser origin story. That's a good story. I love
think it is
manuscripts too. I loved seeing those that showed. I mean, I'd seen manuscripts before, but there were a whole lot of them sort of displayed in such a way that you could really get a good look at them and see a little bit of sense of the underside too. You got a sense of the three-dimensionality of them.
Yeah.
Like he really got into the paper, and you could see that. Yeah.
Is there time for one more question?
Oh, can I say something about Middleton?
Yes.
I saw Middleton's in there. I'm going to say that I grew up as a translator from reading Christopher Middleton's translations, and like early on when I was really into Walser, I would look up something he had translated into German and try and do my own translation of that sentence, and then look to see what he had done. And every time I was like, oh, that's what translation is. Because I don't know, he had such a beautiful sense of how to mold English in uncomfortable, unfamiliar ways to, just not seeing translation as some sort of word for word dutiful task, but an invitation to let a sentence take flight. So he was, even though I never studied with him, although I did get to meet him a few times later on, I learned so much about translation from reading him. So I'm very grateful. And to this day, I love his Walser translations, even ones that I would do something different, because I'm different. I think his view of Walser as shown in his English is just superb.
Is that what you would recommend to desiring translators, is to look at the original and look at a beautiful translation and attempt to copy it?
This literally is an exercise that I do in my introductory workshops. Yeah. It's an interesting way to, it's a way to learn what translation is, to just try it yourself any old way that comes naturally to you, and then see what else is possible, and then try again, and then see what else is possible,
I think if what I'm going to take from this conversation, like the thing I'm going to take the most from it is your concept of language as plastic and tactile, and then thinking of Walser's work as tactile. It's really nice. Well, everyone, I was gonna do the click the book thing. I was gonna do the book.
Sorry,
I'll let you do it, Emily.
I don't want to interrupt your lovely conversation, but thank you, Susan and Kate, so much, and for our friends at Center for the Translation for helping us put this on. And yes, you can buy the book with that green buy the book button. And also, if you'd like to rewatch this event, it'll be on our podcast page here, and we'll also put it on our YouTube channel in a few days. So thank you both so much, and have a good night.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you so much, Kate. This was so great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for coming.